What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Whole Health Podcast, where we talk about anything and everything because anything and everything affects your health. Trying out something new today. You might be watching on YouTube for the first time ever, but I'm actually recording myself with the camera right now while live recording this podcast episode. And then, obviously, you can see from the video, or if you're listening on one of the platforms, it's just me today. I'm going to try to jam-pack about 20 minutes of scientific stuff into about 20 minutes of an episode. But today we're talking about one of my favorite things in life, and one thing that probably affects many of you in one form or another throughout your day, which is caffeine. I'm actually going to go ahead. It's about 5 o'clock, but we're going to go play some games tonight. So I got some of my favorite. Got a White Monster today. But I'm going to bring you a whole bunch of high-impact, high caffeinated info about the most widely used drug in America. All right. So we'll start off with what exactly caffeine is. Caffeine itself is a very bitter tasting crystalline powder. It can be used, it's actually listed in the World Health Organization's one of the essential medicines, because when it can act as a bronchodilator and help breathing, and also stimulate the heart. So it's actually used when infants are born and they're having trouble breathing. They can inject into IVs caffeine to help get them breathing or either stimulate their heart. But for the majority of us, we don't use it as a medical drug. We use it as a recreational drug, which includes coffee beans, tea leaves, or cocoa beans. It's found in a bunch of our food products, and it's like chocolate. Obviously, it's a food product. But 96% of the caffeine in the U.S. comes in the form of coffee, soft drinks, or tea, which in the U.S. it is mainly coffee, which, fun fact, the Boston Tea Party is what kickstarted the coffee trend here in America. Some other random facts before we get into the mechanisms by which caffeine works. According to the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, it takes about 30 to 60 minutes for the caffeine to reach its peak level in your blood, but you start to feel the effects once it hits your stomach in about 20 minutes for it to reach your brain. So you start feeling that cup of coffee in about 20 minutes. But we'll go into depth today about some of the other ways that you start to feel that warm cup of coffee in the morning. And it's used, caffeine is the most socially acceptable drug for a reason, because it can improve mood, concentration, sharpen focus, and increase lifespan, which is a ever-ending research study for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, because caffeine has an effect on dopamine. Okay, well, let's start with how the three mechanisms by which caffeine works in your body. And I'm going to refer majority, if I say coffee and mix it up with caffeine, just know that I'm talking about caffeine. But the first way that caffeine works in your body is by mimicking a chemical called adenosine. So adenosine is created in the brain, and it's a chemical that binds to adenosine receptors. The natural mechanism that adenosine works by is to increase drowsiness. It is what makes us tired. So you wake up in the morning, your sleep has pretty much wiped out all the adenosine from the receptors, and then it starts building that back up throughout the day. Caffeine comes in and looks similar to adenosine, but caffeine binds to those adenosine receptors, mimicking adenosine, and now these receptors can't differentiate between adenosine and caffeine. Now, adenosine, there's two different types of adenosine receptors in the body. There's four. There's A1, A2A, A2B, and A2C. A1 and A2 are the ones we're going to discuss today. A2B and A2C deal more with receptors in the peripheral system. We're talking majority of the central nervous system today. But when the original adenosine binds to these two receptors, that is what causes the slowing down of the heart rate, and it's more of the relaxation effect. And it actually can be used adenosine itself is used as a drug in hospitals to prevent things like severe tachycardia, which is rapid heartbeat. But Caffeine is a derivative of xanthine, which when it binds on these receptors, it has the exact opposite effect. So it actually increases your heart rate. It has increases like the adrenaline response, the fight or flight response, which we'll go into, but looks the same, but does the exact opposite effect. So caffeine essentially increases the cell's effect and causes these nerve cells to speed up. So it's going to cause your blood vessels to constrict, and it blocks. Adenosine typically opens these blood vessels up or dilates them at night to help you sleep. This is also why a lot of migraine medications have caffeine in them, is because they constrict. If you're having a migraine, obviously there's an increase in blood flow to your brain. So if you're having those large pulsing feelings in your brain, caffeine combined with acetaminophen will actually help decrease the blood flow to that area of the brain and decrease your migraine. So just random fact there. So that's the first way that caffeine works, is by essentially preventing you from getting tired. It doesn't actually perk you up, but it just kind of prevents you from getting tired. And we'll go into later about how that affects your sleep. The second chemical, I should go back for a second. These A1, A2 receptors and the effect of the adenosine, it's long-term neuromodulatory effects because they're G-coupled receptors, so they're going to be long-term effects. If you know much about neuro, they're not ligand-gated, voltage-gated, so they're going to have these longer-term metabotropic effects. And that is why you build a tolerance to caffeine. So the second modulatory effect that this caffeine has is actually on epinephrine, which is similar to adrenaline, or increases that adrenaline in your body. But by blocking the adenosine, the caffeine lets those excitatory neurotransmitters stimulate the brain, to move more freely. So now these things are just moving around the brain and connecting to different receptors, and now they're actually increasing the just general neuronal activity in your brain. So your pituitary gland, which is the kind of like the sensing gland in your brain, kind of senses this uptick in activity, and then in turn releases hormones that activate the adrenal glands, which produce adrenaline. So this is the second mechanism by which caffeine works, is by actually increasing your epinephrine. And this is what results in the increased blood pressure, heart rate. Your body basically goes into a fight or flight response when you drink a cup of coffee or have some caffeine or tea. This is what you get those stimulatory effects from. Some things you might notice is that your pupils are going to dilate, your airways open up. Just think about getting chased by a bear. Everything that happens then is going to happen when you drink a cup of coffee. Heart beats faster. The blood vessels to your surface of your skin actually decreases, and then increases blood flow to the muscles so that you can theoretically run faster. Your blood pressure increases. I read online that your systolic increases about 10 milligrams just from drinking a cup of coffee, but your diastolic pretty much remains the same. But this is why you might feel like your hands get a little bit colder after drinking a large cup of coffee, and you just feel excited, and your heart beats faster. You get a little uptick in your heart. The third way that caffeine works is actually the mechanism by which you get that feel-good feeling after you drink a cup of coffee. When you wake up in the morning and you just want that cup of coffee feeling. And that is because this is also what leads to addiction, but that is caffeine and dopamine. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter in the brain that it does a variety of things. It helps activate the pleasure centers of your brain, but it also leads to initiating movement. So in Parkinson's disease, they have a decrease in dopamine production in the substantia nigra, so they have a decreased ability to actually initiate movement, and that is why some people are trying to do studies on whether or not caffeine can help decrease those Parkinsonian symptoms. But going back to why it makes you feel good is because dopamine, drugs like heroin and cocaine, the reason why they're so addictive is because it pretty much blocks dopamine from binding to its receptors, and now all this free-flowing dopamine is going around your brain. Same thing that happens with caffeine. You have more free-flowing dopamine going around your brain, which is why you get that feel-good effect from drinking a cup of coffee. So if you think back to the first time you downed some coffee, you might have had this euphoric feeling of alertness. You feel like you're really concentrated, and you just feel in a very good spot, pretty much. That is from that uprush of dopamine immediately with a cup of coffee. Now, I'm not going to go in too far in depth, but between the A1 receptors and the A2 receptors, one is more long-term and one is more short-term effect. So you have more of a short-term effect, and the long-term effect is what builds up that tolerance. And that's why eventually you get a thing called withdrawal reversal, which is what requires you to drink a certain amount of, or take a certain amount of a drug to get to baseline of what you used to be. That's why, actually, the reason why I first ever started researching this was because in undergrad, sometimes I would try to go a week without coffee. And when I would go a week without coffee, I would actually notice my mood decrease a little bit. And same thing for Lent last year when I gave up caffeine for 40 days. I noticed my mood decrease a little bit, and I was wondering if that was because of there's certain catecholamines in coffee that might not be present in something like an energy drink, or if it was due strictly to the caffeine. But this is what that found out, is those long-term changes that build up tolerance just as much. When you go and stop drinking caffeine, you might experience a mood dip because you're no longer experiencing those baseline levels of dopamine. It might not be perking you up as much as it used to, but it's no longer bringing you back to baseline. So that is why you might experience a little bit of dip in your mood after giving up some caffeine, or if you have it in your cup of coffee until 2 p.m. and feeling a little down, go get that cup of coffee, because it will indeed increase your dopamine and get you a little happier. All right, so those are the three mechanisms by which caffeine works in the system. So in review, we have the first one, which is adenosine. It blocks those receptors and mimics adenosine, so it pretty much delays you from getting tired. It doesn't necessarily perk you up, it just delays you from getting naturally tired. The second one is actually increasing your epinephrine, or your adrenaline, and that's the one that you feel more acutely. You feel increased heart rate, blood pressure, you feel much more alert. And the third way is by interacting with dopamine and changing baseline dopamine levels, and that is to get that feel-good effect. Now, what does this all mean for, most importantly, sleep? Because most people try to take caffeine to prevent themselves from getting tired or getting sleepy. The half-life of caffeine in the body is about 6 hours, so that means it takes approximately 6 hours for half the drug to leave your body. So if you have a big cup of coffee containing 200 milligrams of caffeine at 3 p.m., there will still be about 100 milligrams of the caffeine in your system at 9 p.m. Now, the most important thing to remember here is that adenosine actually affects your deep sleep. So even though you might be able to drink a cup of coffee at 7 p.m. and fall asleep at 10 p.m. still, and that's just something you've done for a while, it could actually be affecting your deep sleep rather than your just ability to fall asleep. Because some people have ability or trouble just falling asleep in general, but you might not be getting the restful sleep that you believe you are getting, especially if you're waking up tired and you feel like you just could not get as good of a sleep as you used to. Try bumping that caffeine and cutting it off a little bit earlier, maybe for 2 p.m. To try to get some better deep sleep. Some other things that I found that I thought was interesting was caffeine and sugar. The reason why I decided to include this was because a while ago I heard the fact that obviously drinking something like a Frappuccino that has a moderate amount of caffeine with a bunch of sugar, it actually affects your cortisol levels and can hold on to sugar and lead to more fat storage in the body if you combine caffeine with sugar. I didn't go too much in depth on this topic in this episode, but I could if you guys were interested. But baseline, I've seen studies. There was an 18-year, the biggest, actually, coffee's been studied, one of the most studied drugs in the world. And there was an 18-year study out of Harvard following 105,000 people. And I think it was, if you have 1 to 3 cups of coffee a day, your chances of getting diabetes was, I think, 24% less. And if you drank 4 to 6 cups of coffee a day, it was 46% less. That being said, it was if they were drinking black cups of coffee. not with a bunch of sugar and milk. So take that with a grain of salt, because also from other sources, like the American or JAMA, the American Medical Association, it basically caffeine makes you less sensitive to insulin. So this is particularly consequential for people that are already pre-diabetic, or if they already are diabetic. Essentially, if it makes your body less sensitive to insulin, your cells won't absorb as much sugar from your blood after you eat or drink. So after you eat naturally, your blood sugar spikes. Insulin comes in, helps break it down, and regulate you back down. If you drink a cup of coffee loaded with sugar, it's going to do the same effect, where it's going to spike your blood sugar up, but it's going to decrease that ability to break the sugar down, so you have more free-floating sugar in your blood, which can go on and lead to higher chances of diabetes. I'm not saying that if you drink sugar in your coffee, it's the worst thing in the world, but that was just something interesting I found. As long as you're aware of how much your daily sugar intake is, sugar is not the devil like everyone says it is. It is just the amount that you consume, and how much you exercise really determines, how much sugar you should be eating each day. But also, caffeine also makes it tougher just to bring it down to a healthy point. But when caffeine releases those stress hormones like adrenaline itself just prevents the cells from processing the sugar as much, because it wants to prevent any short-term use of anything in case you need to survive, which in turn might prevent your body from making more insulin or naturally increasing that amount. I'm not a dietitian, so do not take my word as truth on this 100%. So obviously research this. But there's also adenosine. When adenosine is blocked and that protein's blocked, it decreases the speed at which blood or sugar from your blood is absorbed. So that all being said, caffeine and sugar, you should just watch your intake. And, frappuccinos themselves have a crap ton of sugar. So maybe avoid those, but still have your teaspoon in your morning cup is completely fine, as long as you're pretty active. All right, the last topic is going to be caffeine and exercise, which caffeine in itself is able to increase athletic ability by 3%. Now, this comes in a variety of manners. 3%, what does that mean? Caffeine works in two different ways. About 2 months ago, I saw a YouTube video that said caffeine really helps with aerobic endurance compared to, and less with things like lifting weights, which includes more of that short burst of energy. But essentially, there's 4 main reasons why caffeine will help you either lose weight or just exercise harder. Majority of the weight loss supplements that you see online that are cutting edge fat burner, they're going to include high amounts of caffeine. And that because itself, caffeine is going to be a thermogenic, and it's going to help increase your natural metabolic rate. But we'll get into this in a minute. First, caffeine does work on those adenosine receptors, so caffeine is basically going to help you exercise harder, longer, and thus, because it's helping you exercise longer and less, you don't get as tired as soon, you're going to burn more calories. That's just the natural first way that caffeine is going to help you in the gym, is that you're going to be able to exercise longer. And that's why it might be better for the aerobic athletes other than the more weightlifting athletes. Second, it might actually make you burn more calories at rest, which is this is that thermogenic effect, the noradrenaline, or the adrenaline that is produced from the caffeine secondary to the caffeine. This will speed up your metabolic rate. This is something that just doesn't happen with just caffeine. Whatever increases your epinephrine or your adrenaline will increase your metabolic rate. Keep in mind, though, this is a very short-term effect, and it will fade if you consume caffeine every day. So if you consume a black cup of coffee at the same time every day, or the same amount, eventually that thermogenic effect is going to decrease, because your body is going to regulate to that amount. So you have to eventually increase it, and eventually you're going to fry your system. So I wouldn't recommend relying solely on caffeine as a fat burner. But caffeine does help mobilize lipids in fat cells, which can be used for energy and also just help burn that fat more efficiently. I don't know how much research is done on that, but apparently it does in some form mobilize the lipid in your fat cells, which can lead to fat loss, especially if it's white adipose. Fourth, caffeine can suppress appetite by activating that sympathetic nervous system. So by activating that fight or flight response, if you're getting chased by a bear, your body's not gonna want to be hungry at that point. You're gonna want to be focused more on surviving. So in that survival mode, you're gonna be less hungry, and it's gonna appease your appetite, which will ultimately lead to you consuming less calories. Two, research studies I found in terms of exercise. If you run or play sports or do any other endurance-heavy activity, you can take 100 or 200 milligrams of caffeine before your workout, and this will block that A1 receptor and help you exercise for longer. But if you do more high-intensity stuff like weightlifting, you will want to take higher levels of caffeine, so 200 to 600 milligrams. That's completely up to your discretion. Any kind of a pre-workout can typically run, 150 to 300 milligrams. And the American Heart Association recommends around 400 for most adults in the U.S. and less than 200 milligrams for adolescents in the U.S. So, this is, if you're trying to lift weights, it might not necessarily help increase that 1 rep power, but it will help you lift longer. If you want to increase that 1 rep power, I recommend using creatine powder. It's going to affect more of that creatine phosphate pathway, that 10-second energy pathway. There's some research I found like last month or in January in the Strength and Conditioning Association journal and the Journal of Sports Medicine. They came out with an article involving caffeine and creatine, and how for a while it's been said that the effect of creatine, the uptake of creatine is diminished by concurrently taking with caffeine. If you are worried about this, but in which I went more into depth in that in research this past week, or yesterday, I guess, when I started researching for this podcast. But it's kind of trivial if you're an everyday athlete. If you are a high-performing athlete and you're down to every gram on your diet, you may want to consume the creatine after your workout instead of concurrently with your caffeine. But for now, the jury is out, and just continue to use your creatine and caffeine however long you may desire. So let's just end on some quick coffee facts or caffeine random facts. You can't actually overdose on orally ingesting caffeine. You would need to drink about 20 or 30 cups of coffee within like less than a minute in order to overdose. You need to have 10 grams of coffee, which most coffee only includes like 80 milligrams, which is like a fraction of what you need to overdose. That being said, though, you do need to watch those caffeine pills. They are straight up powder and can be very lethal if you take too many. For those people that take the caffeine pills, just watch that. We already talked about the acetaminophen. But there's actually 2 types of coffee in the world. There's 2 types of beans. There's Arabica and Robusta. Arabica is way more common. Those are the majority of the plants that you're going to find is the Arabica species. That's going to be a little less bitter, but a little bit less caffeine. Robusta actually tastes more bitter, but actually contains more caffeine. But I think it was like 90% of coffee beans you taste are going to be Arabica. Brazil actually grows the most coffee in the world. There's only 2 U.S. states that grow coffee beans, and that is Hawaii and California. There's a certain climate called the coffee belt, which is pretty much above and below the equator to the whatever those parallel lines are. Going back to like 5th grade geography. I don't know. But yeah, there's only certain, and there's like Latin American coffees are more rich in like cocoa, whereas African coffees are more floral or like earthy, whereas Asian coffees can be more of that floral taste. It's floral and more of the lighter roast. But I love like Kenyan coffee from Starbucks. If you ever need a recommendation, there's a great pair, which is the Kenya coffee from Starbucks and the lemon pound cake from Starbucks. But let's leave on some practical stuff. What can you do leaving here today, knowing more about caffeine? And that's just recognize how much you're intaking each day. For example, the Monster I'm drinking right now has 140 milligrams of caffeine, and people will say, oh, that contains so much caffeine. Well, actually, a grande cup of black Starbucks coffee actually includes or contains more caffeine than this Monster does. There are some caffeinated energy drinks that contain some upwards of 300 milligrams, whereas a Coke only contains about 50 or 30 milligrams of caffeine. So there's a big difference in the sizes and Like a venti pike at Starbucks contains about 260 grams of caffeine. So it's really just be aware of how much you're drinking and kind of be aware of your pattern. So if you want to kind of get a new effect from the caffeine, back it off for a few days, maybe get up for a few days, and kind of just reset and give your body, hit the reset button. A lot of times you can lead to adrenal fatigue, which is something you should look into. But it can really be used as a great method to increase your natural energy, but also it's good to take a break every now and then. So I just recommend you researching how much you drink a day and just being aware of that. But that is all I have to say about caffeine. Caffeine was actually founded by a goat herder. His goats would eat these cherries off these branches. I think it was in Central America. But the goats would start getting kind of crazy. And so he realized that these things were causing that. They would get like increased energy. But fun fact as well, if you go to Starbucks, the coffee bean is like the inside of the coffee cherry. But the cascara flavoring at Starbucks, that's actually the cherry flavoring around the coffee bean. So that's why it's kind of sweet. You can actually eat that. So that is what the cascara flavoring is. But thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Caffeine and learned or leaving with a little bit more knowledge on our world's most popular recreational drug. If you need any coffee recommendations or energy drink recommendations, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. And also, if you can, go leave a review on Apple Podcasts to help spread the keeping in everyone's feeds, because Apple has an algorithm where it might not show up if it doesn't have enough attention and nurturing. But as always, I appreciate you all listening, and until next time, #health.